What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Comparative Politics. I hope that you're doing fantastically well. Good morning. Hope that you feel rested and ready to go because we are beginning a new unit today focused on nations and ethnicities. This is going to be a really interesting discussion because discussing nations gets us into the differences between states and nations. And we explore not just the differences, but how nations become important to states and vice versa. And so this conversation will draw on the concepts that we've already learned and the perspectives that we're already familiar with while introducing new ideas and new examples and new concepts. And so I'm very excited to get started, and I ask that you engage as always and contribute and provide your input and your feedback and engage the ideas of your classmates as well. And so as we set out, I do want to tell you that near the end of the course today, we will watch a video and then do a group activity where we evaluate some of the information in the video and then come back together and have a discussion. And the idea here is going to be to kind of break into smaller groups and discuss things together as students and as colleagues before you come back to the class. And so this will introduce a new component for the course, and we'll be doing this much more as we go forward. Let's go ahead and get started. As you know, today we are beginning a new unit on nations and ethnicities. And like the state, the nation is a challenging concept. It's a concept that is often misunderstood and sometimes confused with the notion of the state itself, as we've already seen. The idea or the concept of a nation or an identity or an ethnicity can be quite elusive for all these reasons. And much of the understanding that is out there is sometimes distorted. And so we're going to begin today with a series of statements that are quite common and that you've probably seen very frequently out there as you come across ideas related to the nation or the state. And these three statements are as follows. First, a nation is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a particular country or territory. You may have also seen something like this. A nation is a large body of people associated with one particular territory that is sufficiently conscious of its unity to possess a government of its own. You may have also seen the simple idea or the simple statement that the nation is the territory or country itself, the actual geographic unit. And the question that I want to put to you first is, what do all of these statements have in common? And what they all have in common is that all of them are wrong. All of them are wrong in some specific way. They may contain ideas or fragments of ideas that are important to the concept of a nation, but they also contain elements that are incorrect or that are misleading or misrepresentative. And I want to ask you, first of all, why is it that a nation is not a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a particular territory or country? Why is it that a nation is not simply a large body of people associated with one particular territory that is sufficiently conscious of its unity to possess a government of its own? Why is it that a nation is not the territory or country itself? Before we continue, I'm going to step back a little bit, and I want to encourage you to provide your input through the chat. It doesn't have to be extensive, but if you have any comment or response to this, I'd like you to comment and explain or say why, or say how we know that these statements do not accurately depict or represent the nation as we know it. And use the chat, and I want you to draw on and think about what we've already learned in the class, specifically as it relates to states. So does anyone want to say anything or make any comment about why these statements are incorrect or why they are wrong? I'll sit back for a moment, and I look forward to hearing from some folks through the chat who might comment on why these statements are incorrect. Why are these statements incorrect? How do we know? Efren says, a nation, for instance, the United States, has a diverse set of cultures and languages. The US has influence on other sets of nations, such as territory. Efren, do you think, for example, that the United States may contain multiple nations? Is that what you mean when you say that the United States has a diverse set of cultures and languages? Stephen says, well, take the United States itself. We call ourselves a nation, but we are not fully united by culture, religion. We have very different beliefs. Good, Stephen. So, Stephen, would you also agree, or would you suggest then that the United States may have multiple nations, or that there may not be a single nation? Do you think that that's an accurate statement, or a general idea that's on point? Nina says a nation is able to exist with more than one type of person based off common descent, history, culture, language when they inhabit the country or the territory. So Nina's picking up on a similar point here, which is that these places or these territories often contain a range of different languages or identities. And the idea that there would be any single nation or group based on these characteristics is maybe a stretch in many instances. Anna Martha says, because also nation is a system of laws. Efren agrees then that a multiplicity of languages might mean multiple nations, or that there may not be a single nation. So that's another piece of input from Efren. Alejandra says, a nation is more political than ethnic. It describes the form of government. Alejandra, do you think that a nation in that way is similar to a state, or do you think that the state might be more closely tied to the type of government in terms of like the institutions or the structures that would form the government? Do you think of those as related to the state as well as the nation, or do you distinguish between those two? Stephen then agrees that yes, there may not be a single nation in the United States because of that multiplicity of languages and identities. Neela says, because within a nation, there is a lot of diversity of culture, ethnicity, religion, etc. Much like the US is considered a melting pot. Yeah, absolutely, right? It may be hard to say that there's a single nation. In that sense, these statements might be too narrow, and they may sort of misrepresent what a nation really is by focusing on characteristics that may not be held or shared by all members of different groups in a society. Kevin says, so territory is a component of having a nation. By having just a large body united, they do not necessarily form a government, and a nation does not need to share those to be a nation. Just because you are conscious of a unity to possess a government, it still does not mean that it is a nation. It could be associated with a territory. Instead, ideology and having ties to land is different than a country nation. Good, Kevin. So you're pointing out correctly that, look, the nation may be one of many nations inside a territory. And it may not be so simple as to say that there's a single group sharing all these characteristics. And we know that territory is something that's geographically bounded and doesn't have those qualities of identity or recognition or mutual understanding or ideas that would form the nation, right? So they're just fundamentally different things. And we'll talk about that more. Jake says the nation, again, using the United States, doesn't just occupy one territory. Good, Jake. This is something that we discussed already in class. And we know, for example, that there are some nations that span many states and some states that have many nations. Kevin agrees with Jake. There seems to be a lot of consensus here about the limits of these different statements. And I'm very happy to see that we're really on point and kind of on the same page here. Let's get to what is exactly wrong with these statements. And let's kind of do this process where we work through the differences in the concepts before we eventually get to a clearer definition of nation that we'll use in this class going forward. So in the simplest sense, a nation is just a collectively held identity. It really is an idea. It's a mutually understood or shared sense of collective purpose or community shared by people in a group. This is collectively held, meaning it's psychological and it's in the heads of the people in the group. It's an identity, meaning they think of themselves as representatives of some group or some entity. And their idea is that they are members of that group. So they self-identify as members of that group or that larger whole. This is the notion of a nation in the broadest sense. The state, by contrast, is a collection of political institutions. And so states may have a variety of nations, but the state itself is really just a collection of structures, right? Buildings in the simplest sense. It's not an identity. It is an idea in the sense that the state is an abstraction, but it's not a sort of sort of self-identification kind of thing. It has more to do with this constellation of different institutions and organizations that pursue specific goals. In the simplest sense, the state is an institution, whereas a nation is an identity. And this can kind of be misleading in the way that this is often portrayed, this kind of confusion between state and nation. For example, the United Nations, what they really mean is not the United States, but that is what they mean. But there's a country called the United States, and so it makes sense that they wouldn't name it the United States. But what the United Nations is a collection of states. It's not a collection of groups of people who self-identify and share an identity. The individual states that form the United Nations may contain a variety of nations and may contain a variety of identities that don't fall neatly under a single heading. And so in the first place, you can see how our popular understanding of state and nation often get kind of overlapped and misconstrued and sometimes combined in ways that can be very misleading and not make a lot of sense for us from the perspective of political science. And so in the first place, you need to know that a nation is an identity. It's really an idea. It is an abstraction in the same way as those political institutions that form the state, but it's an identity that involves self-recognition and a commonly held belief or idea about who they are and how they share a common experience or background or set of characteristics. And so state versus nation is an important distinction that we have to make before we eventually begin to unravel this concept of nation. Now, it's also the case that nations need not have their own governments in order to be nations. Remember that some of those statements said that these nations possess their own government. Well, we know that there are many nations that don't have their own government. The Kurds, for example, an example that we already used in class, this is a nation that spans many states, and they are generally the minority in these states, and they don't have their own government. In fact, in many cases, they don't even have representation. But we wouldn't say that the Kurds are not a nation. They're certainly a nation. The Kurdistan is a nation. It's just that it's one that doesn't have its own government. And so we can't say then that a nation needs to have its own government. It's just not the case that government is an essential component of this concept. Many nations span several states. These nations, they don't have their own government. This is the key point here. But there are also many multinational states, that is, many nations that share a government. And so even in those cases where we might say that nations have representation or have a government, they may very well be sharing that government with other nations. There may be multiple nations in multiple different collective identities held by different groups within a state or within a territory. And so another example from class that we've already used is the case of Switzerland, where there are many different language groups, including Italian and French and German. These different language groups can be thought of as linguistic and kind of ethno-linguistic distinctions between different groups within Switzerland. These different groups, we can't say that any one of them possesses its own government, right? They're all effectively sharing the Swiss government. And so it's not the case then that a nation possesses its own government. It just simply is not true. We can see plenty of examples of nations that don't match that criteria and don't fulfill that criteria. And so here's another criteria that we throw out. Not only do we distinguish between the nation and the state and define the nation in a way that excludes any territorial or state-like distinction, we also exclude a notion of possession of a single government. It's not necessary for the concept, and it really kind of distracts us from what a nation actually is, which is a political identity held commonly by a group of people. I'm going to take a look at the chat really quickly because we might have some input here. Ian says, so if a nation and state mean different things, what's a nation state? Could Canada be considered a multinational state? Yes, Canada is a multinational state. Ian, to answer your question, I don't have a specific definition for you, but a nation state would be sort of like the idea that some states may contain a single nation. Some states do contain a single nation. Not all states are multinational, but when we think about a nation state, we're combining the idea of a commonly held collective identity with the idea of possession of a government. And so in that case, there may be many nation states that have multiple nations, but that we call nation states, and that would be inaccurate to call them nation states. But there may also be some cases that are, actual nation states with a single nation. But the point that I'm making to you is that it's not essential to the definition, and we don't need to define a nation in terms of possession of a government by a single group. There are cases that we might see that, but it's not actually part of the concept in any actual, literal, real sense. Joris says, so would the United States be a multinational state, given this country is very diverse? Absolutely, Joris, it would. And we have other examples of multinational states that we could look to as well. And you can see that in this case, the United States, there is no one nation that possesses the government. It wouldn't be accurate to say that. The country is very diverse, and that diversity ethnically and linguistically, religiously, is all relevant to our understanding of a nation. And so nations and governments, not necessarily going hand in hand in terms of our understanding of a nation in like a pure sense. Now, we also need to address this issue of nations and territories. If some nations span several states, which we've already discussed and learned in this class, then it follows that a nation cannot be the territory or the land that's controlled by the state itself. It just isn't the case that a geographic unit is the nation itself. It just isn't. Nations may inhabit and obviously inhabit some geographic unit or multiple geographic units, but those geographic units aren't by definition part of the nation. That's not what defines the nation. And by the same token, an identity is not a geographic bounded territory. It's a collectively held idea. A geographic unit is a literal thing, right? You can literally go and look at the borders drawn by these states. A nation is a collectively held idea. It's in our heads. It's something that is psychological and that we share. It's not something that is well defined and that is concrete in a way that the geographic boundaries of a state are. And it's also the case then that we can say, for example, that decolonization in creating new territories, it did not produce new nations, right? If it is true that a territory is a nation, then decolonization should have produced new nations. But as I show you here with this picture, most of these decolonized states have many nations. And so look, here on the left, we see colonies in red prior to decolonization in the 50s and the 60s. And what you see is that there are a variety of diverse variations across the place. But after decolonization, we didn't necessarily wind up with a whole bunch of new nations. All those same nations still existed. It's just that the geographic boundaries in the actual territorial units representing these places changed. And so this is kind of an interesting little test. If we really do believe that territories and nations are the same thing, then decolonization should have produced new nations, but it didn't. These new states in Africa and elsewhere contain many, many different nations. And those nations, as we'll see, often stem from earlier and historical processes that really transcend decolonization or any process of the parceling out of geographic units through decolonization. And so this is really important because we've got to understand first and foremost that the understanding of nation that often pervades discourse and debate is just simply incorrect. It's not true that nations are territories and territories are nations. It's not essential to the definition. The question then becomes, what is a nation and why does it form? If a nation is not a territory or a group possessing its own government, and if it's not a state, then what is it? And what do we mean if we say that it's an identity or a political identity? And how do these identities or these ethnicities or these nations emerge if it's not a territory or a government or a state? These are the questions that we're taking on today. And this is the set of issues that we're addressing through this discussion. And as we set out, I want you to kind of open up your mind as fully as you can so that we can kind of deprogram ourselves and move away from some of these mistaken notions of nation that pervade a lot of the debates. And we begin by simply pointing out that a nation is a grouping of individuals who associate with each other based on a collectively held political identity. Okay, so there are a couple key elements in this definition. A grouping of individuals associating with each other based on a collectively held political identity or an idea or a mutual understanding about who they are and how they relate to each other and what they share and the characteristics that they share and the experiences that they may share and the various kinds of processes that maybe produced this group in helped this group to reach its kind of consciousness and its self-consciousness. And this is very psychological. We're really in the heads of people now. We're moving from state institutions and buildings and organizations to the heads of individuals, actual people like ourselves. This is where, though it is still abstract, it does become more concrete because we can think of our own experience. And if you think of your own experience, and if you think of yourself as belonging to a nation, you'll recognize that a nation has both objective and subjective characteristics. So for example, nations tend to share the same language, the same religion, they share common traditions, they share a past experience or a historical experience that may have produced their consciousness. These are objective things, right? They are things that exist and can't really be reinterpreted. A language is a language, a religion is a religion, traditions are traditions, a history is a history. But there's also a subjective feature that is much more prone to sort of reformulation, and that is the idea that the nation is a psychological construct. Again, it exists in our heads. And what that means is that as a construct, we develop and evolve that notion through time and through our experience that we share. And so we may have a shared experience, but we may re-envision and reinterpret our understanding of the nation over time, and we may evolve in a way that reconstructs our understanding of the nation. That is the subjective component of a nation. Nations are both objective and subjective. And I want to reiterate before we continue that we're talking about people, actual people, you and I, us, right? As individuals and as groups. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about a nation, a grouping of individuals who associate with each other based on a collectively held political identity, which has objective and subjective foundations. So the nation, obviously quite important. And as we proceed, you'll notice that we're going to be kind of discussing nation and identity in tandem, because a nation is a collectively held political identity. So we're really talking about the debate over the nation by discussing identity and ethnicity. And when we talk about the debate over the nation, we really focus on three big approaches that have been developed over time in comparative politics. And these three approaches all answer the same set of questions. And those questions are, where do identities come from? And why do nations form? And if we have these collectively held identities that are political and are constructed psychologically and are objective and subjective, where do they come from? How do they arise? Are they eternal and timeless, or do they emerge out of processes that we're involved in on a given daily basis? What is the true origin of these identities, and how do we understand why they may differ from one another and where they came from and where they're headed? There are three approaches, and the first approach and the oldest approach is called primordialism. And this is a theory that sees identities as natural and based on objective criteria. It sees identity as timeless and eternal. It's universal and continual. There is no beginning, there is no end. That's a challenging idea, but the basic sense of this theory is that these nations precede all modern states, and that these nations will persist and continue even if states go away. It's the sense that these nations are based on criteria and foundations that objectively distinguish us from one another, and that will be timeless and eternal and will outlive anything else that might happen to the state or the government or the territory. There's also instrumentalism, which is the second oldest theory. And this is a theory that sees identities as created by rational, self-interested elites, right? Elites weaponizing political identity to shore up support for themselves and their parties or their groups, to benefit themselves, to preserve or enhance their power and their wealth. Instrumentalism is all about the self-interest of those in power in the way that they can use the mechanisms of the state to cultivate identity for their own interest, and often against the interest of others who they may be in conflict with. Instrumentalism is very different than primordialism because instrumentalism sees these identities as really in the hands of state elites. That's a very different idea than the notion of identity as being eternal and timeless. And then finally, there's the third theory, which is constructivism. Constructivism sees identities as created by a process of social construction or sort of discovery The idea that we're continually recreating our mutual understanding through new experiences and things that arise that we experience together and that affect our understanding of ourselves and our identity and our ethnicity. Constructivism is the newest theory, and it's very much informed by international relations. And it, like international relations, focuses a lot on groups in the way that they reconstruct their identities and their relationships with one another and how that can affect politics. So let's begin with the oldest theory and kind of reiterate this and take a look at some examples that help to flesh out what this perspective is all about. This primordial view of the nation basically says that modern nation states come from pre-existing proto-nations. And the idea is that nations formed prior to the formation of modern states. So wherever there's a state, there was always a nation that came first, or nations that came first. And these pre-existing nations are called ethnies. This is the language used by the theory. These ethnies are eternal and timeless and objective, and they share a distinct culture, language, religion, physical characteristics, and so on and so forth. The idea is that the primordial nation preceded the creation of the state and will outlive the creation of the state should something happen to the state. Again, we're emphasizing this kind of timelessness that we associate with, this notion of primordialism. This is the idea. These pre-existing ethnies survive and persist and outlive all else because of their timelessness and the sort of objectivity of their criteria and the distinctions between the different groups and the different identities. This is a classical theory, and it was the first predominant theory of nation and identity in comparative politics. Let's take a look at an example through the lens of Afghanistan. Now, we've discussed Afghanistan in this class a lot, and it's a case that is very interesting, not just because of the struggle with state formation and state strengthening in Afghanistan, but also the proliferation and survival of all sorts of different ethnic groups who've historically found it difficult to collectively identify as Afghans. And so in Afghanistan, it is true that Islam has unified Afghans against foreign and non-Muslim invaders in the past, including the Soviet Union. But Islam has never been enough to unite all of the different ethnies or ethno-linguistic groups in Afghanistan. Those ethnies are linguistically distinct and they predate the Afghan state. And so some of those major ethnic groups include Pashtun, Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, Baluchi, Punjabi, and Sindhi, but there are others as well. The reason I point out these ethnies, if you will, is because we can see that even in Afghanistan, or perhaps particularly in Afghanistan, it didn't require the formation of a nation, or there wasn't the formation of a nation that went hand in hand with the formation of the state. To the extent that a state exists in Afghanistan, it does not exist based upon a single group or a single nation. There are many, many nations. And these ethnies are ancient civilizations in the sense that they predate the formation of what exists as the state in Afghanistan. Now you might say, could it be that the Afghan state is weak precisely because of this diversity and this sort of multinational composition of Afghanistan? Interesting, perhaps, maybe something to think about. But the primordial view of the state would focus on these differences between the major ethnic groups and the timelessness and the kind of eternal sort of origin of these different groups. This is the primordial view of the nation, focusing on nations as preceding states and as separate from states and as being timeless and eternal. There's also the instrumental view of the nation. As we talked about, let's go into more detail with this view before we look at an example. States formed before nations existed. Now, this is the opposite of the primordial view. It's exactly the opposite, essentially. Whereas primordial view says that nations predate states, the instrumental view says that states predate nations. And the idea is that modern states were key players in the formation of the national identities that we associate with the nation or understanding of the nation. Why? The argument is, according to the theory, that states require what we call homogenization. States have to forge a national identity because the division of labor within the state requires unity in order to actually work. People have to conceive of themselves as linked in some way for themselves to function in this division of labor that parcels them out and separates them from each other. That's a structural reason, highlighted by Gellner in 1983. But there's also a political reason that states require homogenization, according to this theory. And this reason is that the nation legitimates the state. What do we know about the state? Well, we know that the state needs legitimacy. It needs to uphold a legitimate monopoly of violence. Only if it is able to do that does it function as a functioning state, with that monopoly of violence. It must be legitimate. It must be legitimated. Well, who or what legitimates the state? Hobsbawm in 1983 said that, well, it's the nation that legitimates the state. It's the formation and the cultivation of a collective identity in that group of people with that shared identity who legitimate the state and create the foundation for state power in the sort of establishment of a monopoly of violence. So this is the exact opposite of the primordial view. It's putting states in charge of the creation of nations and not viewing nations as preceding states. So, for instance, we can say that there is no French nation without a French state. There's no German nation without a German state, and so on and so forth. Hold on, everyone. I'm sorry. There's a problem here with that. Continue share. Okay, so we've got the examples of France and Germany. And the instrumental view of the nation would emphasize, for instance, the fact that in France, there were a variety of language groups and ethno-linguistic groups that existed in France, and that the French state had to create a French state or a French nation that brought together these various linguistic groups and forged an identity that was particularly French, right? Because previously, what the French state or state elites found was a variety of different language groups and different ethno-linguistic foundations that didn't necessarily serve the formation of a single nation. And so it became important for the state itself to forge that national identity and to bring these groups under an umbrella that would help them all to self-identify as Frenchmen. In a similar way, you can take a look at religious divisions in Germany prior to the sort of formation of the German state. And what you'll find is that there was no single nation from the perspective of religious unity or religious solidarity. There was a great deal of diversity in different religious bases for belief in Germany. And it was only through the creation of a modern state and the sort of consolidation of a sense of German statehood and nationality that there was the creation of a German nation. And again, the idea is that states precede nations and states create nations. Nations don't create states. Instrumental view being directly opposite the primordial view in this way. This is a good example of how states create nations. And there are books about this. Eugene Weber, for example, wrote a book about peasants into Frenchmen. And the idea of the book was that state modernization carried out between 1870 and 1914 helped to sort of forge and cultivate a national identity. That identity was what it meant to be French, right? The French nation. And so we went from all these language groups who didn't necessarily form a coherent whole to this nation of Frenchmen through the involvement in the role of the state in the process of modernization. And so this is a good example of the role of the state from the perspective of instrumentalism. Now there's the third view, and the third view is the newest view. And the third view is the one that is in some ways more interesting from the perspective of time and evolution and process, because the constructivist view, the third view, views the process of the creation of the nation as a sort of unfinished project. It's an open book, so to speak. Nations are the product of jointly constructed understandings of the world that form the basis for the shared assumptions about reality that the members of the nation have. The members of the nation are constantly, jointly and together recreating their mutual understanding of themselves and their ethnic and linguistic group, their religious basis, and so on. This is ever evolving, and it's a process that doesn't necessarily end. It's a process that's linked with contingency and history and other things that happen that would affect that set of shared assumptions and that set of jointly constructed understandings of the members of the group. In other words, the idea is that you and I, in the way that we conceive of ourselves as belonging to a nation or not, is going to be influenced by what we experience together through history and through time and through politics. And that can change from day to day, from year to year, from week to week, month to month, and so on. And so this was best captured by Benedict Anderson, who in 1983 said the following in a great book called Imagined Communities. He said, "Members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, yet in the mind of each lives the image of their community." And with this quote, he really got to the heart of the matter, which is that in general, the nation is a psychological construct, but in particular from the perspective of constructivism, because it exists in our heads. In that image, we recreate constantly, and we retailor and we refashion that image through this process of creation that we engage in together. This is very different than both the primordial view and the instrumental view. And it's interesting for us because we can see how each of these perspectives might have a lot of bearing on the real world when we take a look at actual examples, which we'll do here in a moment. So to say more about the constructivist view as the newest theory, there's an important role for print culture. What is it that helps people to reconstruct and reconstruct their self-identity or their self-understanding of their identity or their mutual understanding of their identity? According to Benedict Anderson, the main thing is print culture and the dissemination of ideas and things like the printing press and TV, popular culture and sporting events, things that take the form of culture that is written down or becomes sort of instantiated in society in a way that is permanent, right? So national TV and sporting events and holidays and popular culture, newspapers and television and books, all of these things help to capture and sort of focus our understanding of how we construct ourselves as a nation. In the process of reconstruction takes place through the creation of new culture and new TV and new events and new books and new newspapers and so on and so forth. And so it's represented with an image like this, where we see all of these different groups in the Latin American context here in this example, kind of coming together in some way where they're constructing some sense of a nation, but yet still retaining some differences. The point here being that they conceive of themselves collectively as a nation, even though they individually and as groups may be different. And so this is an important theory that helps us to make sense of the picture in a way that primordialism and instrumentalism do not. Now, what we're going to do for the rest of today is the following. We're going to watch a 15-minute video from Vice News about political identity and Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea. Now, a little context. Many of you may know, and I hope to not insult your intelligence, but in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, invaded Crimea specifically. And they still occupy Crimea to this day. They've essentially annexed Crimea. And what was interesting about this process was that Crimeans themselves responded in a variety of ways to this annexation. And the ways that they responded often helped to highlight their understandings of their relation to Russia and the Russian nation, and their understanding of their own belonging and where they fit and what nation they belong to. And I'm telling you at the outset that it's not a simple story. There are different perspectives, different senses of nationhood, different senses of who belongs to what nation, and so on and so forth. And what's so important about this discussion in this video and what's captured here is that it highlights some of the differences between the perspectives, and we get to see in real time how the minds of people make sense of their psychological construct and their belonging to a nation or their political identity. And so before we watch this video, I'm going to take a look at the chat because I think someone has something to say. But once we finish the video, I'm going to put you in some breakout rooms, and I'm going to ask you to discuss the video with your classmates in those rooms. There'll be about 3 or 4 students in each room, and I want you to specifically discuss the question of the different evidence supporting the different perspectives in this video. And before we do this, let me take a look at the chat because I think someone's got something to say. Do we have to take notes in the video? No, Efren, I don't think it's essential, but what I'll tell you is that what I'd like you to do is think about what evidence from the video supports the primordial view, the instrumental view, and then finally the constructivist view. And this is what you'll discuss with your classmates. And so as you watch the video, you may be thinking about those perspectives and how what you're viewing fits or does not fit with those perspectives. But I don't think it's essential for you to take detailed notes. What I'd like you to do is just discuss this with your classmates when given the opportunity so that you can kind of engage these issues and these themes and these perspectives together through a video that helps to clarify and kind of illustrate the differences, not deliberately so, but in a way that is self-evident. And so let's watch the video. And once the video is over, I'll split you up and we can proceed to have a more rigorous discussion. And then eventually as a class, we'll discuss this more generally.
Ощущаю гордость, ощущаю радость, и что я наконец-то жительница Российской Федерации.
Только один выбор. У вас есть только или вместе с Россией, или вместе с Россией.
С кем граничит Россия, да с кем хочет.
For 60 years, Crimea, a strategically important peninsula in the Black Sea, has been a part of Ukraine. After the pro-European revolution toppled President Yanukovych in February, the majority ethnic Russian population, with the help of Russian soldiers, took control of the region. An illegal referendum on whether to join Russia or not was held shortly after, and the next day Russia annexed the peninsula in a move widely condemned by the international community. On May the 9th, Russia and Ukraine celebrate Victory Day, which commemorates the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. This year, with Russian President Vladimir Putin making an appearance and Russian power and pageantry on show, the parade in Sevastopol acted as a transparent and symbolic show of force.
Я рад быть здесь, в героическом Севастополе, в этот священный день. Уверен, что и 2014 год войдет в его летопись, как год, когда живущие здесь народы твердо определили быть вместе с Россией.
Своего и референдум прошел, и мы оказались в своей матушке России.
Сегодня праздник это общественный, народный праздник. Праздник России в первую очередь, наверное, я бы так
Советского
сказал.
Союза.
Советского Союза, тот, который был. Мы к нему
И
снова
Украина, и Беларусь.
возвращаемся, и мы поддерживаем это.
Крым оказывается сейчас действительно в центре внимания общемирового сообщества, и есть люди, которые очень приветствуют присоединение Крыма к России, то есть рады, вплоть до каких-то состояний таких эйфорических. То есть такие люди, конечно же, есть, которые сохраняют свою принадлежность гражданскую Украине. И это, в частности, те, кто написал заявление об отказе принимать российское гражданство. Более 50% населения, они все-таки принимают факт вхождения.
90% населения.
Это по референдуму.
Не лгите. Вас нужно убивать. Не вопрос. Чемодан, вокзал, Россия. Я вернулся домой в Россию.
Это москвичи, это российские журналисты.
Как тебя зовут?
Андрей.
Паспорт где?
Дома лежит.
Были, есть и будем россиянами.
Так. Многие пытаются все-таки как-то найти способы адаптироваться к новой реальности. Но, конечно, есть некоторое ощущение неясности. Вот, и в целом это общую тревожность повышает.
That new reality, for some, means having to hide their identity when talking about their opposition to Russia's annexation of Crimea. With a number of pro-Ukrainians having been beaten, kidnapped, and even killed, the fear of speaking openly is very real.
Мне как-то было всегда, вот, допустим, Россия и, ну, все как бы все братья, да, вот все братья. Но когда вот случилась вот такая агрессия случилась со стороны России, вот, когда начали вот действительно вот эти вот зеленые человечки вокруг, вот тогда я поняла, что я украинка.
То, что произошло в Крыму сейчас, это захват территории, оккупация, без всякого предъявления санкций и войны. Здесь буквально произошел захват территории без чего-либо согласия.
Им же не люди нужны. Зачем им? Я, зачем им? Мать моя, зачем им? Родственники мои, именно народ крымский. Для России здесь усилить только свой военный полигон нужно. Все. Для этого они все это сделали. По-другому, я считаю, России Крым не нужен. Только для этого.
With Crimea now coming under Russian control, people who wish to remain have to apply for a Russian passport, but the infamous Russian bureaucracy is not making it easy.
Но руководитель ни вчера не было, и, вероятно, сегодня нет. Мы не можем его вызвать даже сюда. Поэтому бардак. Но это надо и следовало было сделать. Я россиянка. Конечно, я за Россию и считаю, что Крым только должен быть российским. Это несправедливые ошибки, это руководители. Крым – это Россия. Ну что, уже пенсии выше гораздо. Это, как бы я на пенсии особенно не делала раньше. Но это приятно. И, знаете, самое главное, что Россия обогрела вот этих стариков, которые немощные, которые адмиралы, генералы, да, чуть ли не с протянутой рукой стояли. И это Украина.
Это с утра прийти стоять до вечера не получишь.
Могут приехать
не
даже,
получишь.
можно обратиться.
Разве можно? Это же там давали, стояли. Теперь сюда приехали.
Вы сидите
Стой.
дома, приедут.
Какой черт приедет?
Да,
Никакому мы уже не нужны. Надо бы скорее туда упали.
Вынуждают получать российские паспорта. То есть как бы заявляется, что вы автоматически стали гражданами России. Каким образом? Я человек, я не знаю, я не баран какой-то, которого можно автоматически там куда-то перевести. Если ты не получаешь паспорт, ты не можешь перерегистрировать документы на машину, ты не можешь устроиться на работу. Вот я сейчас потеряла работу. Ну, экономические стороны присоединения уже начинают заявлять о себе. То есть сезон, который нам обещали, наплыв туристов, их нет. Крым пустой, никаких туристов, собственно, кроме военных туристов, так называемых, нет. Крым не способен, по сути, вообще обеспечить себя ни водой самостоятельно, ни продуктами питания.
В принципе, моя позиция изначально была такая. Какая мне разница, в какой стране жить, и главное, чтобы никто не воевал, и все жили дружно и мирно. То есть, либо я был бы в Украине, но без каких-то вот военных действий, либо в России без военных действий. То есть, мне было с этой стороны одинаково.
Украина — это страна, в которой я родился, в которой я рос, и которую я действительно очень люблю. Но, тем не менее, лично мое мнение, что референдум защитил нас от таких событий, которые произошли в Одессе, в Мариуполе, и нам удалось обойтись без пролития крови.
Мое личное участие в этом, я не голосовал, если честно. Я тогда проспал, потом у меня были дела еще кое-какие. Это как популярный еврейский анекдот. С кем граничит Россия, да с кем хочет. Вот.
Потому что свой выбор на референдуме я объяснял тем, что я выбираю меньшее из зол. Но мне почему-то казалось, что в России будет чуточку получше.
В
принципе, люди настроены вполне даже положительно, кроме, конечно, некоторого такого сообщества, к которому отношусь я, это гей-сообщество Крыма. Может быть, все-таки наш позитивный, улыбчивый Крым все-таки сможет подавить это ужасные, ужасно мрачных настроенных людей. Может быть, я до кого-то и донесу, в принципе, потому что у меня так получилось. Если даже я родителей смог убедить, то уже это большой шаг.
With a bleak economic future, the outlook for Crimea's youth is far from certain. Whilst there were protests in support of the revolution in Crimea, pro-Ukrainian activists who opposed Russia's annexation have been violently targeted by the new Crimea authorities.
Меня зовут Андрей Щекун, я руководитель общественной организации «Украинский дом», и с 24 ноября 2013 года координатор Евромайдан Крым. Что интересно, что в Крыму тогда, это впервые, если за всю историю, очень много людей выходило на проукраинских засадах. То есть мы шли улицами, мы кричали «Слава Украине», «Героям слава», эти все были лозунги проукраинские. То, что слышал Майдан, то хорошо передавалось ощущение и в Крыму. Разные масштабные акции, и местные СМИ очень работала на власть против нас. И привели нас в милицию, милиция забрала у нас паспорта. Я, когда начал говорить, объяснить, что здесь происходит, на каком основании, сейчас тебе все объяснят, придут наши старшие от самообороны. В плену я был с 9 марта по 20 марта. 20 марта где-то около 7 часов утра нас обменяли.
А вы знаете, кто вас держал?
Они себя называли Крымской армией. Крымская армия. И допросы нас наводили к спецам, так званым спецам. Те охранники, которые себя относили к крымской армии, они, видно, что они их более-менее слушались и боялись даже. То есть, видно. Повели в комнату, посадили на стул, привязали руки скотчем и ноги к стулу. И говорят, сейчас будет допрос, мы тебе желательно, чтобы ты отвечал. А потом вопросы касались, были, значит, три такие контакта вопросов. Первый, что касается моя связь с правым сектором. Вот. Они в этом не верили, говорят, не может быть координатор Евромайдана не связан с правым сектором. То есть у них логика вот такая была. Когда вопросы задавали, я отвечал, говорит, неправда, врешь, и и включали электрику. Я почти теряя сознание, то есть я просто, когда типал у меня, я падал на правое колено, то есть и практически отключался, тогда отключали электрику, в принципе, когда видели. Тем более, когда охранники получили оружие 11 числа, они уже там хвастались патронами, они говорили, что им помогла Россия. Братья Россия нам военно, и Путин Вова нам подсобил. То есть они не скрывали это и говорили постоянно. О том, что они дальше пойдут, что они сейчас получат оружие, наведут порядок в Крыму и пойдут дальше на Украину. То есть сперва Юго-Восток, потом и Киев возьмем, а потом, если надо, до Львова пойдем и до Лиссабона. Даже фраза звучала, что пойдем, если надо, до Лиссабона.
Сегодня мы находимся в здании Киевского исполкома, где происходит выдача готовых паспортов Российской Федерации гражданам, проживающим на территории Республики Крым.
Сегодня 13-е, да, по-моему? 17-е, спасибо большое, да, 17-го. Мы пришли получить российские паспорта. Счастливы безмерно, потому что большую часть жизни мы прожили в России, а меньшую часть в Украине. Счастливы, что мы вернулись в Россию.
Ощущаю гордость, ощущаю радость, что я наконец-то пришла к себе домой и что я наконец-то жительница Российской Федерации.
Как он красивее украинского. Вот украинский. Сейчас красивее.
И желание у них сделать снова СССР есть. Они не просто об этом как бы намекают на это, да, они выступают за это. И вы можете об этом услышать.
Власть американцев над всеми континентами и на всей планете, вот это уходит. То есть модель мира меняется. И это оптимистично. Потому что я считаю, что настанет золотой век, когда люди будут счастливы жить, да?
Поэтому это тоже очень пугает и напрягает. И я вам скажу, что я так себя чувствую, как люди чувствовали себя, не знаю, в 1939 году, в 1938, когда приходили НКВД от Сталина, да, и говорили, мы вот вас арестовываем. И я волнуюсь и переживаю, что они могут прийти и за мной.
То есть наша семья уже здесь больше 300, там, как я так смотрела в генеалогическом этом дереве, проживает именно в Симферополе. Поэтому о выезде куда-то, конечно, речи быть не может.
Я считаю, что и не только я, и вообще мнение многих специалистов, что то, что происходит сейчас в России, на Украине, в Крыму, последствия будут, ну, то есть это последствия, которые растянутся на десятилетия. То есть это травма коллективная, психологическая травма не отдельных граждан. То есть это травма не на уровне отдельных судеб, это травма вообще коллективная на уровне славянской нации.
Okay, so this is a video that puts a lot of things in perspective, but I want to put it to you in your groups just which theory is most supported by the video, primordialism, instrumentalism, or constructivism. And I want you to address the question, what evidence supporting those theories of identity is presented in the video, and ultimately, which theory of identity seems to be most illustrated in the video. So I'm going to put you in some breakout rooms of about 4 or 5 students, and I want you to discuss these questions with the other members of your group. And then what we'll do is we'll share our group's thoughts with the class. Maybe if there's a designated speaker, if someone wants to speak or use the chat, you can use the microphone or the chat, but we would like to hear from as many groups as possible. I'm going to go ahead then and put you in those groups right now. I'm going to stop the share for just a moment and set up the rooms. And we'll spend about 5 to 10 minutes discussing this. Discuss this together with your classmates and your groups, and we'll get back together and hopefully hear from as many of you as we can once we join together again after working in our groups. We'll take about 2 more minutes and then I'll close those groups, and we'd like to hear from as many groups as possible once we come back together. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and close the rooms, and we'll repopulate the class. Okay. So as you rejoin the classroom, what can you tell us? Which theory of identity does the video most support? And again, I encourage you to use the microphone if you'd like to. You can also use the chat. But let's hear from the groups.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Kevin.
So we kind of discussed that it's split almost between instrumentalism and primordialism. I believe it was. Yeah. Because those who so for instrumentalism, those who were in support of Russia seemed more along the idea of using Crimea as, I mean, it's a perfect spot for to have access to basically the rest of the world, and it's a really important port. So it's more of a pragmatic occupation or confederation almost. And then those who were more in favor of Ukraine, I mean, the one lady said that her family had been there for about 300 years. That's more primordialism in the sense that their ethnic identity is fixed on Ukraine, and they don't necessarily want to become Russians.
Excellent. Yeah, this is borne out in the video without a doubt. Great. That sounds really good. Can we hear from some others? Are there additional points that can be made, or what else can we say about this?
Can I go, or?
Yes, Efren, go ahead.
So I just want to add to the point of what the previous person said. So in our group, we discussed that it's also like a combination of the same two approaches. And so for instrumental, it's like what I said is for I cannot pronounce that word for some reason. It's homogenization.
Homogenization.
There we go. I'm having a tongue twister day. So it's like the definition is that is the process of making things of uniform or similar. So in the video, it seems that Russia's trying to make the nation like similar to Russia, like it has to adapt the same process and it has to adapt like the same similarities. And then for the first approach, someone said that it's like the nations formed before states. So it's basically like it's forming this like processing of creating like a new state. So that's what our group mostly talked about, and I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that sounds great. That makes total sense. I think that's accurate. Russia appears to be trying to like make Crimea conform to Russia, and that's very instrumental. But the issue of like time and identity was clearly relevant too for a lot of those who said that they felt closer to Ukraine. And so, yeah, that sounds great. What else can we add to this discussion?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Manuel.
I was kind of conflicted because, like, I was thinking, was there ever truly really a nation there? Because if you have two different types of people, one who opposes Russia and wants to be independent, and then you have another section of the country where they'd rather become Russian, and there's a conflict of interest there, you know? And so I don't know, I just wanted to point that out at least.
Yeah, that's very relevant, right? Because it means then that the nation that we may think exists doesn't really exist, and it might be easier for Russia, for example, to peel off those who feel more Russian, and maybe abandon those who feel Ukrainian. But in the very least, the presence of multiple identities complicates things a great deal, and it makes it hard to say that may have been a single nation. And so I think that is relevant. Good. What else can we say to this?
I guess the 50% of the people are agree with the annexation. That means the other 50% of the people, they are not agree with the annexation of Crimea. But
yeah, so there is this division, and that division means that there may have been multiple identities beforehand. And this is interesting because it may mean that that primordial view is relevant, but it also may mean that there could be a role for constructivism too. What do you think?
construction is already did, I guess, in the past, because Crimea was in the treaty in the past was a lot of stuff on between I mean Ukraine and Crimea, but I guess the federation are doing the same like US in other countries. And then I know because the intervention of United States in Afghanistan, by example, or the sanctions that imposed to United States, to Russians, and then you know, if a power like Russia is try to reclaim a territory that in the past it was part of the Russia.
So do you think that supports instrumentalism, or do you think that that's primordialism or constructivism?
It's maybe legal. It maybe take more time, but it's okay.
Thank you very much, Anna Martha.
Okay.
I think that you were breaking up a little, so we weren't able to catch everything, but your points that we heard were very clear, and thank you for sharing. I'm going to take a look at the chat and see what we have to say in the chat. Rady says primordial and instrumental. Mostly primordial, I would say. David says, my group agrees as well, since Russia is seen as this powerful nation that may want to seem as powerful as possible, which requires them to do actions. Yeah, so there's certainly a role for state power here in shaping identity. Think of, for example, the passports that were given to all the Ukrainians. Think about, for example, the pensions that were increased according to that woman. All of these are examples of state actions taken to try to cultivate or forge that identity. This is the use of state power to shape identity. Certainly supportive of the instrumental view. David says, my group agrees as well, since Russia is seen as this powerful nation. I think I read that one. But absolutely. Nina says, our group sensed more of an instrumental view in the video. Those that identify with Ukraine are reluctant to fully immerse themselves in the Russian nation, which shows that they believe the state is important in what nation you identify with. They most likely have the mindset that if there is no Ukraine nation in Crimea without the Ukrainian state. Okay, good. So again, we're seeing the links between the state and the nation. though we don't define the nation as the state, we certainly see that there's a role for state power. And the instrumental view seems to capture this in a really lucid way in this video in particular. Rady says, I also think the video mentioned something of Crimea being a part of the Soviet Union. So there is also an indicator of constructivism based on the experiences that Crimea citizens experienced as a part of Russia during that period of time. Good, Rady. So there's this historical process, this kind of experience and the social construction that took place during this period of belonging to the Soviet Union. In that longing, in that sense of connection to the motherland, as they often would say in that video, seems to suggest that there's an element of psychological self-construction and kind of collectively held identity forged through the experience with the Soviet Union. And so that is absolutely relevant. And what's great about this video is that all of the theories are borne out in some way in the evidence depicted in the video. And so we can see constructivism as well as instrumentalism and as well as primordialism. Stephen says, I feel that there is also a little bit of constructivism specifically with some of the Crimean people. One yelled to the camera, we are Russian, we've always been Russian, even though they are part of Ukraine. Totally, right? So that's an interesting example of how, according to some of those people who said we're always Russian, that's an example of how primordialism might have been more important than constructivism. We might be in Ukraine now, but we've always been Russian. Even before the creation of the Soviet Union itself, we were always Russian. That sense of fixed time and that kind of eternal, timeless, universal belonging that is expressed definitely falls under the primordial heading. And so what's so effective about this video and so useful about this discussion, as you've seen in your groups and individually, is that there's evidence for all three perspectives, and we can interpret the evidence in a variety of ways, and we can see a role for state power, as well as a role for historical experience and construction, as well as a role for this kind of timeless ethno-linguistic identity that seems to kind of proceed and kind of persist well beyond the creation or the collapse of any state or any collection of states or any union. And so in the end, what I want you to recognize is that we can interpret the evidence in a variety of ways, as long as there's evidence to each point. In this video, we see all three perspectives on offer. Some of those perspectives may be more borne out than others. For instance, I think that the instrumental view relates especially closely to the use of state power by Russia to kind of impose citizenship on Ukrainians. But there's certainly a role for the timelessness of primordialism as well, just as much as there is a role for social construction that took place during the Soviet Union. And so this is a really good example of how we can take a look at the psychology of individual people to learn about identity and how these identities are formed and how they come about and how they persist and how they change and how they interact with state power, history, experience, and so on and so forth. So this was an excellent discussion today, everyone. I'm very happy with your contributions, and I'm so happy that we could get to the bottom of this. On Thursday, we will continue our discussion of nations and identities and ethnicities, and we'll get into more of a discussion about nationalism and forms of nationalism. We'll also talk about some different ways that state power becomes important in the creation of nations from the perspective of the instrumental view. So thank you very much for your contributions. You're free to go at this point. If you'd like to stick around and talk with me or ask questions or make comments, I'll stick around as long as you'd like to. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and you're free to go. Have a great day, and I'll see you on Thursday.